And we're live. Hello, Tom. How are you today?
Hey, Carlos. How are you?
I'm doing great. Welcome, Tom, and also want to thank all the people tuning in from the various platforms that we're live streaming today, whether you're listening in on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Periscope. We're simulcasting to a lot of different platforms. And today I'm very excited for our special guest, someone that I've personally known for several years and someone that's done a lot to help the disability community or people with all abilities, and that's attorney and friend Tom Blessing. And Tom is with the Masalamani, Jeter, and Carson LLP. Tom is very distinguished in the area of educational law. Tom is, again, currently a partner. He practices education law, representing parents and students with claims arising under individuals with disabilities, the IDA article section. So has done terrific work here in our state of Indiana. So Tom, welcome to the live stream, and thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me. I look forward to it.
Yeah, well, I tell you what, it's perfect timing, Tom, with all things considered, as parents begin to navigate what the return to normal is as it relates to education. And even though it's a very vibrant situation, I think it's important to tell a little bit around your background, because I think it's important. So if you would like to share, Tom, with our listeners a little bit more about yourself, please.
Absolutely. I've been practicing education law for about 10 years now, and I exclusively represent parents and their children, almost all of whom have some form of disability. I represent some students that have other situations that are unrelated to the disability realm, so to speak, but almost all of my clients have special needs, and they attend public schools throughout the state of Indiana. So I represent people literally statewide. I mean, from the northwest corner to the southeast corner, and points between, and come up with all sorts of interesting situations, as you can imagine, involving kids and the things that they're dealing with in our public schools.
Yeah, and then also just as it relates to our community and helping those with all abilities, it's something that again, as parents and parents being advocates, and it's nice to know, Tom, that the work that you do when there is that struggle with the schools, that there is a process. There's a process to helping families, and as we navigate through COVID and the schools are making the necessary adjustments, it's also important to remember that there are certain laws that apply that protect people with different abilities. So if you want to just touch base with those, I know probably most of the people listening may know of those, but can you share a little bit around, the IDA and the ADA, as it's important to help those with all abilities that relates to their education?
Absolutely. There's a pretty comprehensive framework of federal statutory law that is designed to address the challenges people with different abilities have. Most people are familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which turns 30 years old. So we're sort of observing the anniversary of that landmark legislation. Another statute that people may not be as familiar with is the Rehabilitation Act, which was another federal piece of legislation passed in 1973. And then the third one, and the one I primarily work with, is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. We just call it IDEA for short. And that's the one that's geared primarily towards students in public schools who have special needs.
Yeah, great. And then also, probably a lot of the listeners are familiar with the IE programs that are built to help combine some of the accommodations that are maybe necessary to help those with all abilities. And Tom, in regards to that, what are your thoughts or concerns as we'll just go right at it, talking about COVID and the different types of scenarios? Do you have any initial concerns as parents begin and students begin back into school? Any initial concerns in regards to any policies or procedures at the schools that may apply to some of those accommodations?
Yeah, unfortunately, a complex and overwhelming process is about to become more complex and overwhelming for parents. Starting in March, the U.S. Department of Education has issued several guidance letters or memoranda that are supposed to give public school districts some ideas on how they're supposed to proceed with handling children that have an IEP, for example, which almost all of my clients either have an IEP or they should have an IEP. So what the U.S. Department of Education did in March is issue these little bulletins, almost like little memos, to schools, but also to parents, to tell them how this changing landscape is going to affect their children. And unfortunately, they haven't given people real clear guidance, either school districts or parents, on what's going to happen and when it's going to happen and how it's supposed to look. So aside from the guidance that was issued by the U.S. Department of Education, the Indiana Department of Education has also issued guidance. And unfortunately, to a parent reading those, even if someone reads and understands every single word and retains it, remembers it, the parent's still probably going to find himself or herself asking, what now? Now that school is supposed to resume here in the next few days. So I'm concerned, number one, I'm concerned at the lack of direction that parents have. But frankly, I think school administrators and school teachers may be almost equally handicapped in that regard from the standpoint of what do we do? How is it we're supposed to comply with the federal law, specifically the IDEA, now that school is about to reopen? And so I'm very worried that parents don't have a lot of the answers and schools don't have a lot of the answers either. So we're going to have two groups of people that aren't really sure how they're supposed to do their jobs, respectively, as parents or school teachers.
Right, absolutely, and I want to be mindful of that. These are very challenging times. Not only for administrators, educators, parents as well, and I'm sensitive to that. But at the same time, I think there needs to be important discussion to be had in regards to what is protocol, what is the standard, and already in our ability group, there's the conversation in regards to the mask, and that seems to be it's not a political issue. There are people who do have either sensory related issues or perhaps maybe just they just they can't stand that in regards to maybe they have a respiratory related issue that they just prefer not to. So even though that's just a small example, I think it's important to begin those conversations with parents who are thinking about that as it relates to their child, their student returning to school. What would be your advice, for example, if someone says, hey, look, I've tried everything, I've done, social skills, social intervention, to try to help with the mask, what it's for and everything. But if it comes down to it, what would be the steps if someone was trying to make accommodations for even like a medical exemption for their student back to school? What would be your recommendations for that, Tom?
Yeah, a lot of the students I represent will not wear a mask, as you point out, for a variety of reasons, including sensory processing difficulties. Some of them, frankly, don't have the cognitive ability to understand why it is they're being asked to wear a mask. They just don't understand the purpose of the mask, and therefore, why are you putting this thing on my face? In others, it's a practical matter of, for example, someone with a hearing impairment. If someone has either a cochlear implant or a hearing aid, that individual may not be able to wear the mask, or the mask might somehow interfere with that device. So what I would tell parents is, certainly if your child can wear a mask, will tolerate a mask, to do so. However, there are going to be a lot of kids who simply cannot or will not keep it on the face, in which case I would first approach the school and explain the situation. And if the school understands it, fine. If not, then it's probably time to get a note from a provider, whether it's a physician or a therapist. I'm not sure what the school is going to accept. For example, a certificate of incapacity is what we typically would use to excuse a child from regular attendance. Well, that is a form used by the Indiana Department of Education, which by law has to be signed by a physician. not a psychologist, not a speech therapist, a medical doctor. So I don't know if schools are going to insist that parents produce a note from a doctor. To me, that seems a little impractical and unreasonable. But certainly a note from the child's provider to excuse the child from wearing a mask would be in order. And I think if schools are going to insist that students with disabilities wear a mask, I think schools run a risk of violating the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, because as you know, schools have to make reasonable accommodations for people with a disability. And if someone cannot wear a mask by virtue of his disability, it's a reasonable accommodation, in my opinion, to allow that student to not wear a mask at school.
Yeah. Now, Tom, with that, would that exemption, medical exemption for the mask, would that be included in their IEP, their individual education plan, or is that something you'd recommend them doing? I mean, that process in itself is going to be challenging, just with the social distancing aspect of it and everything. But is that something that should be included in the IEP once that's established?
Well, typically, any accommodation for the student would be reflected in the IEP, or in the case of the other statute I mentioned earlier, the Rehabilitation Act, sometimes commonly referred to as Section 504, kids with a 504 plan would have it listed as an accommodation. So yes, in a perfect world, that accommodation would be reflected in the IEP. However, it's probably not realistic for parents to get that incorporated into the IEP on such short notice. Now, if the school will do it with just a phone call or an email, that's great. But I don't think it's practical to expect IEP meetings for all these kids who want to have that accommodation added. So as far as I'm concerned, it should be and is best addressed without making any revisions to the IEP. You're not really changing the education program as such for the child. You're simply saying this student doesn't have to wear a mask.
Right. Shifting gears a little bit, Tom, have you thought about through the entire e-learning process as it relates to those with disabilities, as far as any potential accommodation needs or any transition? Have you thought through that personally to think what might be some of the obstacles with that or some of the concerns that arise?
There's a lot of obstacles. And now that we've had a 4-month experiment, I think it has been, with e-learning, the consensus among people I'm talking to, parents who are calling me, is that it's been a disaster. Teachers aren't teaching, students aren't learning, there's technology hiccups. Sometimes people can't even log on to the particular platform that they're supposed to be using. They've got the usual distractions at home with other children and dogs barking, and it has just been, in my estimation, a failed experiment. Now that we've had a few months to try it, it hasn't worked.
Yeah, well, I think in part it may be, leaving some of those with disabilities behind, primarily when I think as it relates to most students with IEPs or accommodation allows for, either some one-on-one time, an aide to help them either take notes or to help them, even through maybe like a test of some sort. So I definitely see that concern arising. Is there any solution that you can think of through that? I mean, it'd be almost impossible for schools to necessarily, provide somebody to help with that e-learning. Am I missing something there? Is there any?
No, you're not. You're not. And the solution is really simple. Reopen the schools. Get kids back in school. General education, special education, everybody. Now, I will tell you, I have spoken to a couple, I mean, like 2 or maybe 3 parents whose children actually did better using the e-learning, but they are the exception to the rule. And for the most part, children with disabilities have not done well at all with the e-learning. And take, for example, a student with an ADHD diagnosis. You can't sit her in front of a computer and expect her to learn. It's just not going to work. The e-learning, generally speaking, does not take into account each student's individual learning style And when you think about it, it really can't. There's no way to do that. So the solution is to reopen the schools and get kids back.
Very well said. I couldn't agree more with that, Tom. Just as we begin to navigate and get back into the school systems, and there's going to be issues arise. There's no doubt about that. It's already taking place. Could you kind of walk through a model for us, if you will, the correct problem resolution that you recommend to parents as they go through this, as far as maybe just a best practice or protocol, if you will, for resolving some of those issues that arise?
Well, the first thing I always tell clients is to document everything. If they're communicating with the school, they may have a phone conversation. It might be a friendly chat in the hallway. They might run into the teacher in the parking lot. That's great, but they should always follow those oral exchanges or those communications with an email. Because as you and I know, if it's not in writing, it never happened. Many times, unfortunately. So parents would do well to communicate primarily through email. And as I said, it's fine to talk to people at the school as long as you follow that up with an email sort of summarizing or recapping the conversation. Because as you can imagine, many times school personnel may not recall conversations later. And so it's just a good idea to document everything. The other thing I'm really worried about with parents, Carlos, is they may be asked to sign documents, the significance of which they don't really appreciate at the time. I'll give you a classic example. Let's say your child's school is actually going to reopen. They're actually bringing students physically back into the building. And your child has an IEP. And in the first couple days, somebody at the school, it could be the front desk, it could be your student's teacher, someone says, okay, now that school is reopening, we're just having all the parents sign this just as part of the COVID-19 reopening. Okay, so the parent says fine, wants to be cooperative and helpful and doesn't see any harm in doing it, so the parent signs it. Well, the parent may not realize what she just signed, and I'm worried about that because in some states, schools have asked parents to sign waivers. And those waivers have basically excused the school from complying with the IDEA, the federal laws that I mentioned earlier, or excused the school from implementing that particular child's IEP. So I want parents to be very wary of requests to sign anything, because unless they know exactly what it is they're being asked to sign and appreciate the significance of doing so, that's very risky. So I would just caution parents. The safest thing, of course, is to not sign anything. And there's going to be IEP meetings as schools reopen. Those could be tricky as well, because schools could make changes to the IEP. So what I'm telling parents right now is just don't sign anything until you look carefully at the document, take it home, ask for a couple days to look it over and think about it. Don't just sign it on the spot, because once you sign it, you're stuck. And it's harder to fix or change something after the fact than it is before you sign it. So I'd be very worried about parents signing anything at this point, because I just don't know what schools may try to present them and ask them to sign.
Yeah, that's great advice, Tom, and I think a good portion of that as it relates to the fear factor with COVID, and it's a legitimate fear. You see it, not only from some of the students, but also some of the teachers apply, and I think it's going to have to take some common sense. I think that there's going to be just as much responsibility and accountability placed on not only just the educators, but on the parents as well. I mean, how many times do you see where maybe a child wakes up with a mild fever, but you give them some Tylenol and it suppresses the fever, and you still send them to school and it only lasts a couple hours. So I think it's, this is going to be a unique time where I think parents need to really assess that. And, Johnny or Elizabeth, whoever, may not be able to go into school for their Valentine's Day celebration because they're sick and they need to stay at home. But those are some of the things that I think parents are going to have to think through and be very cautious of that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think parents do have one pretty substantial protection as things stand right now, and that is there's their child's IEP. Now, I haven't seen everyone's IEP, but I've seen them. I've read hundreds of them over the years. And I can tell you that chances are, if your kid has an IEP, it's probably not very good. But your child at least has an IEP. And the reason that's significant, Carlos, for the people watching, is that IEP cannot be changed without a case conference. So if your child has an IEP, she or he has the benefit of what's called stay put, which simply means nothing can change without a case conference. So the safest thing to do with respect to your child's IEP is nothing. Because if the school wants to change it or wants to reduce the number of minutes of speech therapy, let's say, per week, that your child is supposed to be receiving under her current IEP, school can't change that without a case conference. So your shield, if you will, if you're a parent, is your child's IEP, because that is what the school is supposed to be implementing. Whatever IEP your child had in March when all the schools closed, well, guess what? That is still your student's IEP into the case conference.
That makes a lot of sense. And so I think I distracted a little bit or deterred from our initial conversation. That was just in regards to the protocol procedure. So in regards to seeking out counseling or legal representation, Tom, when do you think is the time for that? Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Sure. Any parent who feels like this isn't right, you get that sort of funny feeling that maybe the school's trying to pull something that's questionable. Maybe it's perfectly legal, but usually that instinct, that intuition, that vibe, if you will, is a pretty good indication that maybe something's not right here. And if that happens, a parent ought to talk either to another parent or a parent advocate, or go online and maybe look up to see if this particular issue has arisen with another parent, or talk to a lawyer. And most of the lawyers who represent parents, and there aren't many of us, but most of us are happy to talk to parents, no charge, answer their questions. I look at parents' IEPs every day for no charge. Parents just send them to me, and I'll look them over, I'll read them, and I'll get in my impressions, without charging them anything. And I can usually get a pretty good sense from looking at the IEP where there's a serious problem there that ought to be addressed.
Yeah, that's terrific. That's great. And then also, Tom, if you could please, closing thoughts, and then also for our listeners, how can they learn more about you, your practice, or seek out any type of legal advice with your firm?
Absolutely. I would encourage parents to get their kids back in school. They're probably going to want to ask for a reevaluation. It's been about, 6 months since there's been quote unquote real in-person school. So in addition to the summer break, we had basically the second half of the spring semester stay away. So I would encourage parents to either request a reevaluation by the school psychologist, or parents can ask for what's called an independent evaluation, or an IEE. And that's done by a psychologist the parent chooses. It's not the school psychologist. That's done by a private psychologist chosen by the parent, not employed by the school district. And if it's done the right way, the school district will pay for that evaluation. I think it's really important for parents to get a good handle on what we call the present levels of performance for the child, now that school's been out for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. And for those tuning in, I know it's been value added to me because you answered some of the questions that I had. And then also in regards to your firm, you guys do have a Facebook page that people can go over and like. And check that out over there. Again, it's at MJ Attorneys that you can find their Facebook page. And then their website address is mjcattorneys.com. So, Tom, thank you so much for a great discussion. And for those tuning in, please like, share, and subscribe. So thank you, Tom, and enjoy your afternoon.
My pleasure. Thank you, Carlos.